Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica Lunchtime Talk with Professor Christen A. Smith from Cite Black Women Collective. During these chats while you chew, you'll meet interesting people or organizations that are doing cool and complementary work to what you're currently learning about in the Summer Institute at Howard. If you don't have your lunch yet, hit pause. For those of you with food and beverage in hand, let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christen Smith, and I am one of the founders of Cite Black Women and part of the Cite Black Women Collective. And I'm excited to be able to share with you today. And I want to say thank you to the organizers and particularly to Nanette Coleman for inviting me to be here today. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Cite Black Women. And first, I want to get started by telling you about the history of Cite Black Women. And telling you a little bit about what it is. And so Cite Black Women is a campaign that I started back in 2017 that in essence seeks to bring attention to Black women's intellectual contributions by redressing our erasure in citational indices. And what do I mean by that? Meaning that pretty much across all disciplines, Black women are undercited. Our ideas are ubiquitous. We are constantly being quoted and looked to as sources of information. We're always the faces of diversity campaigns and conversations, particularly right now in the era of Black Lives Matter, as we're talking about things like abolition, as we talk about, deconstructing and dismantling carcerality. Black women are the face, and particularly Black feminism and Black feminists are the face of those conversations. What's ironic about that is that many times our ideas, our brilliant and amazing ideas, are appropriated without giving us credit for them. And part of that is part of a larger genealogy of erasing Black women and what I would call extractivism, right? And so we all talk about extractivism, particularly when it comes to the history of settler colonialism, right? And the idea that colonialism as a project, as a historical project and a contemporary project, is built on the idea that you land on somebody else's land, you pretend nobody was ever there, you claim it, and then you extract the resources from it, right? And so everything that's happened from the slavery, conquest, colonial period, from the 1500s up until now in the continent of Africa and in the Americas, and also in Asia, and particularly South Asia, right? All of these colonial moments have really operated on a similar logic. And that similar logic also extended into slavery, right? And particularly this idea that people's labor and people's bodies can be the natural resources for extractive labor. Why am I putting it in that historical perspective? Because part of what the legacy of that history is that in addition to the colonization of indigenous lands and the expropriation of Black labor and Black bodies and the exploitation of Black people through slavery, in particular in the Americas, of folk who were displaced and captured and brought from Africa to the United States, and the historical exploitation of our labor, one of the legacies of that is also the exploitation of our bodies and our ideas in the contemporary moment. And that particularly becomes something that's salient in the lives of Black women. And so when I think about this, I think a lot about the work of Hortense Spillers, right? In her really canonical article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, where she talks about how Black women's bodies and reproductive labor was the exploitation of Black women's bodies and reproductive labor, was the heart of the slavery enterprise, right? And so as Black women, we're not only mules of burden, but we are also reproductive sources of capital expansion, right? For all intents and purposes, and particularly through our reproduction of the slavery workforce. So that, in essence, has marked us as people who produce things and produce people, ideas, nurture, suckle, care for the world but don't need to be acknowledged as human beings. And that logic, particularly within the framework of kind of epistemological discourse, and what do I mean by that? Within the framework of intellectual conversations, extends to our ideas. And so oftentimes Black women are seen as nurturers or givers of information and producers of information and producers of ideas, but our personhood, our names, our identity, all of that doesn't matter to everybody. And that is the source of a lot of pain and a lot of violence, right? If you think about that movie that came out a few years ago, Hidden Figures, that was a really great example of how Black women's ideas and contributions to this nation have been erased, right? So you have this whole space program that's built on Black women's labor and Black women's ideas, but nobody ever knew about it till they came out with the book and the movie, right? Why? Well, okay, yeah, it was secret. It was a top secret project, but also that is part of our culture. It's part of the way that this country has worked for hundreds of years, right? And so part of what we need to work on is figuring out, how do we redress this? How do we begin to start to see Black women's labor? And how do we begin to start to acknowledge it? How do we begin to reconstruct the way we understand knowledge across all fields in order to understand and see the hidden figures in our lives, right? If I'm going to put it simply, that's how I would put it. And at the heart of Cite Black Women is that particular impetus. And so I came to this project actually from my own story of pain and violence. So when I was a young assistant professor, first getting started out, I was working on my book project and was working with a graduate student, and that graduate student was paraphrasing and appropriating my work without actually giving me credit for it. That was a very painful experience for me that really kind of spiraled me into a kind of depression around it. And I kept silent about it for many, many years. Fast forward, that was back in the early 2010s. Fast forward to 2017, I go to a conference and my book is out. My book came out in 2016. I go to a conference. I'm back in the back of the conference, getting a cup of coffee during break, watching another person's presentation. And I see a person present a slide with what looks like my words from my book, but as if somebody had taken, the thesaurus function in Microsoft Word and just replaced some of the words and passed it off as their wording and their ideas. And I was devastated. I was heartbroken because this has happened to me before. And to have it happen again just made me feel powerless. And it made me feel as if all of the work that I had done on my projects, on my research, these years that I had spent talking with people and developing ideas and writing this book that took so much out of me, I thought that was being completely undermined and that my words just didn't matter. And I got really frustrated and really deeply hurt my feelings. And I called one of my best friends and I was like, you know what, the next time I go to a conference, I'm gonna make a t-shirt that says Cite Black Women, period. And I'm gonna wear it and I'm gonna dare everybody at the conference to take my words without actually acknowledging where they come from. And it was a joke at the time, but I actually decided I wanted to do that because it was a way for me to speak out when I felt like I didn't have a voice. And so I made these t-shirts, this t-shirt that I have right now, brought them to the National Women's Studies Association meetings in 2017 in Baltimore, Maryland, which happened to be the 40th anniversary of the Combahee River Collective statement. I was there with a collaborator who I was working with at the time, and profiteering, for those who know me, profiteering is not something that I like. I don't like branding, I don't like profiteering. Ironic, because I got a t-shirt that says Cite Black Women, but that's really more about kind of emotional and performative letting off steam than it is about making a profit, right? So I decided I didn't want to make any profits off of these shirts. And I wanted to donate all of the proceeds to a community school that I was working with in Brazil at the time. And that's what I decided to do. I was like, I'm gonna make these shirts, but I'm gonna give all the money to these folks. And that's what I did. And one of the things that really surprised me with all of that was that as soon as I brought the shirts out, one, everybody was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We need this. But two, the stories that people started to tell me, the stories that sounded like my own, the stories that people started to share that of their pain and their sorrow and their sense of helplessness, people's stories resonated with my own. And this was something that I did not realize prior to that point, because I was also suffering in silence like they were. And so the shirts became a way for us to collectively speak out when we felt like nobody was listening to us. And we felt like we couldn't really say anything, because part of the way that citational erasure works is by making you feel, by gaslighting you, by making you feel like you're crazy, like if you say anything, you're going to get retaliated against, like you can't, like it's a dirty secret, right? And so quickly, the shirts kind of turned into something else. They turned into a community, and they turned into a network of people who all wanted to work on speaking out together. A group of my friends said, you know, you got to bring these shirts to other conferences. So I took them to the American Anthropological Association meetings that same year. And there, I was encouraged by my colleagues and friends to actually expand the project from just selling t-shirts. They were like, go on social media. Let's actually start to do something with this. And so that's what I did. I went on social media. I started to talk about citation and what it means and why it's important on social media. And honestly, I was taken aback in a good way by realizing that this was something that was way bigger than I ever anticipated. Our social media platforms, excuse me, especially on Twitter, just really blew up almost immediately. People were very, very excited about things. And it created this snowball effect where something that started out as a campaign quickly turned into a movement. And when I realized that that was picking up steam, I said, you know what? This is way bigger than I thought it was going to be. Let me bring a group of people together in order to make this a collective effort. Because as a Black feminist anthropologist, somebody who does activist research, if there's one thing that I know is that you can't do anything without collective. You can't do anything without collaboration. And so it was back in 2017 that I created the Cite Black Women Collective. And I brought together a group of people who were like-minded, who believed in this particular question and issue. And we started to work together on this project. And we've been working together on it ever since. We have our website. I'll pull it up for you all so you all can see it. Sorry for the awkward pause. This is our website, citeblackwomencollective.org. Here we talk about our story. We talk about our praxis, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And we also talk about our podcast. So in 2018, we began our podcast. And in the podcast, myself and other collective members interview various Black women from the community, from all walks of life, people who are intellectual producers. And when we say intellectual producers, we're not just talking about books, right? We're also talking about artists. We're talking about activists, people who are contributing their ideas and their energy to the world. And so we listen to those folk and we talk to them about their work, about their dreams, about their hopes, about their reflections, etc. And I'll show you, this is our page on SoundCloud. This is, we're in season 2 and about to finish up season 2. The podcast is multilingual. And so we have podcasts so far in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We have listeners from all over the world. And so, you know, whenever you can see when you do a podcast, how many listeners you have. And whenever we launch a podcast, I can go on there and tell that people are listening from Ireland, from Suriname, from Mexico, from everywhere, really. And so this is a podcast that's really gotten a lot of traction, and one that is one of the projects that's near and dear to our heart. We also have a blog on there and have been doing a number of projects to think about kind of archival work, working on partnerships to build databases, working on partnerships to also kind of bring awareness. I'm actually sitting here in Pittsburgh right now because I just finished giving a keynote for the Library Publishing Forum here in Pittsburgh, which is Association of Librarians and Library Publishers who wanted to learn more about citation and the Cite Black Women project. And so the project has really been quite successful and quite wide reaching. And it's one that I think really helps us to understand how we can connect kind of technological and social media and data proliferation, with passion projects, right? And so I want to tell you a little bit more about that by giving you a brief overview of what we do using one of our PowerPoints. And so part of what we have been focusing on is thinking about Cite Black Women, not only, like I said, as a campaign, but as a movement. And at the heart of that is our intellectual project of thinking through it as a praxis, right? And I use the phrase praxis, and when we published our manifesto back in 2021, the word praxis that comes from our title, because this is the title of the presentation is also the title of our collective statement. That word is really one that was inspired by Bell Hooks and Bell Hooks' use of the word praxis in teaching to transgress, So in order to kind of understand this project, I want to say really briefly, talk a little bit about what is citation. So when we think about citation, we think about a quotation from a reference to a book or a chapter or author, especially a scholarly work. But when we're talking about citation within the context of Cite Black Women, we're thinking about it in an epistemic way, one that is much more expansive than the dictionary definition of citation. And so we're thinking about citation as the way that we acknowledge the genealogies of thought and the intellectual communities with whom we are in conversation, right? So how do we pay homage to our elders? How do we pay homage to those people who uplift us within our communities? How do we acknowledge the folk who have influenced us and who our tribe is for all intents and purposes? And so citation is much more than just a bibliography. It's a system of acknowledgement. But within the academy, it's also the way that ideas get validated, right? And it's that validation process that makes the politics of citation so important and so critical in terms of redressing inequality. So why does citation matter? In this day and age, when information is being proliferated through social media and new media, citation is even more important as a way to ensure equity as we continue to find new ways to share information. So citation is the way that we acknowledge the genealogy of our ideas, as I said before. It is also a system of acknowledgement that affirms humanity by recognizing the importance of individual and collective contributions to the world. And it's also an archive. And I want us to think about all of those things, as you can see from the slide, as kind of a tripartite system that feeds on one another, right? So all of these different aspects of citation are all feeding into one another. And in many ways, it could kind of be a Venn diagram, but it's also kind of a circular, cyclical frame. Important to that project of recognizing the genealogies of thought has been our work to really think about how Black women have been talking about the need to cite Black women for many years. And so sometimes, people kind of come back and say, well, cite Black women, that's not a new idea. Why do y'all think y'all made that up? Cite Black Women has never made the claim that we made up the idea that you should cite Black women. That is absolutely not the case. We know that there's a much longer genealogy of thought and a much longer history and tradition of doing this work. And so, for example, Yolanda Moses, who is one of my disciplinary sistren, right, from anthropology, an anthropologist who is the former president of the American Anthropological Association. In 1997, she published an article called Black Women in Academia. And in that article, she writes, Black women have been participants in higher education for more than a century, but they are almost totally absent from the research literature. Rarely is the impact of racism and sexism on Black women in academia examined. And so part of this project around citation is about recognizing that there are systems of oppression and interlocking forms of oppression that have led to the erasure of Black women's ideas and intellectual contributions within the academy. And when we think about those forms of oppression, then we can start to get a clearer picture of why citation, the stakes of citation and the policies of citation are so important. So what is our intellectual genealogy? We, in every way, shape, and form, bring ourselves back to the Combahee River Collective. So the Combahee River Collective was a group of Black lesbian activists who began organizing around Black women's issues in 1974 in Boston. Barbara Smith, who's pictured here, was one of the organizers who suggested that they name the collective after the insurrection that Harriet Tubman planned and executed, at the Combahee River, in Port Royal, South Carolina on June 2nd, 1863. And this was a really important insurrection. It was the first military operation led by a woman in the history of the United States military. It was successful. During that raid, she was able to free over 700 enslaved Africans. And so this is really kind of an example of the ways that Black women's ideas and efforts can expand and touch so many people. And I think that the Combahee River Collective's use of this particular historical moment to name itself also is part of our own genealogy at Cite Black Women, of how we're finding inspiration in the Black feminists and the Black women leaders who have come before us. So their collective statement, which was published in 1977, the Combahee River Collective Statement became one of the formative texts of Black feminist thought. In that statement, for those of you that know about the idea, the theory of intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw coined, Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, Black feminist, who coined the term intersectionality to name a methodology for thinking about how do we analyze the ways that different forms of oppression impact our lives, right? That idea that interlocking forms of oppression shape the lives of Black women is one that we can trace back to the Combahee River Collective. So they write in their collective statement, we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. They go on to say, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. This is an important statement for us at Cite Black Women, because part of what we're arguing is that if we start to cite Black women, if we start to focus on redressing the erasure of Black women in citational practice, then we are all going to get free, quite literally. And so if we recognize that in order to cite Black women, you have to think through and undo the interlocking forms of oppression that affect the academy and the economy of knowledge production writ large, then it is a project for the freedom of all of us, right? And I think that that's important. And I also want to kind of acknowledge that this idea that citing Black women, or this idea that citing women of color, is one that is very much inspired by the work of Sarah Ahmed as well, who wrote a beautiful book with Duke University Press, looking at citation, and particularly the ways that we need to focus on the politics of citation as an approach to thinking about how we can free ourselves from systems of oppression within the academy, right? And so again, this idea has been circulating for a while, it has been picked up for a while. And for us at Cite Black Women, what we're doing is hoping to take those ideas that have been proliferated and really focus it on our community and think through think through this project as a Black feminist praxis. So in 2021, part of what we do at Cite Black Women is research, right? So in addition to the collective statement that we published in 2021 in Feminist Anthropology, which is a journal that there was a special issue that I actually organized with Feminist Anthropology. It is the 2.1 issue, and the entire theme is Cite Black Women. And in that, there's going to be two things that you'll find. The first thing will be our collective statement written by myself, Whitney Pirtle, Erica Williams, and Amani Wadood, all members of the Cite Black Women Collective. And in addition to that, you'll find a research article that presents a pilot study that I did with one of my graduate research assistants, Dominique Garrett-Scott, that looks at the frequency of citation of Black women within the top tier anthropology journals in the United States. And in that work, we analyzed over almost 6,000 citations, which statistically is not a lot for those of you that do quant work, but remember, this is a pilot study. And so this is something that we worked on in order to get our foot in the door to talk about what are the numbers behind citational erasure, right? And so when we did that study, what we found was that while Black women represent about 2.6% of all anthropologists in the United States, we only represent 0.84% of citations in top tier journals based on our sampling. That is an absolute underrepresentation, and it helps us to see the gravity and the urgency of this matter, right? If Black women's work is so important, if we are so critical to our disciplines, excuse me, if our work is being valued, then why is it that we are not being cited at the same rate as our peers? The other thing that I want to underscore this, and you can take a look at that article and it has all of the data and the information, but one thing I want to also let you know is that of this 0.84%, and I have to remember my numbers, but it's about 80%, I think. I should have that number, but I don't have it in front of me. But it's about 80% of the citations of Black women anthropologists within those bibliographies were cited by other Black anthropologists. In other words, if Black anthropologists don't cite Black women anthropologists, then nobody is citing Black women anthropologists. And that should tell you how much inequality is structured within this system, right? And again, I know we're going to do a live Q&A. I'll definitely try to bring those numbers to that, and we can talk about that more in the live Q&A if you have questions about that. But that is something that helps us to see, what's the data behind this picture. This is exactly what we're dealing with. So I want to close by saying that our story is not over. We're doing this work. We're working on bringing awareness. We're doing it on multiple platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and also through our podcast and our website. But we're also working to expand these projects. We're in the process of thinking through what are our next steps? What are the things that we can be working on? And what are the collaborations that we can make in order to truly bring this story into, bring this issue to the mainstream? I have seen tangible, measurable impacts from this campaign, from this project. I'm always I'm kind of a skeptic at heart, so I'm always taken aback or surprised when I see people actually, following through on things. But there have been special issues of journals organized. There have been conversations happening. There are a lot of conversations happening around the need to diversify editorial boards. There have been conversations happening about the need to create databases, about the need to change the way that we write our syllabuses, at the graduate level and at the undergraduate level, in my own department of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. Our faculty did a syllabus audit to try to see what are the actual rates at which people are citing non-Black folk in their bibliographies, right? And so this particular movement is catching on, and it's having an impact. And it's having an impact primarily because we've been able to use these multiple platforms in order to get this story out. Again, I want to emphasize, you know, Black women in the academy have been talking about this for quite some time, but it's this new moment of new technologies, of new ways of communicating with one another that is allowing us to have the platform to really talk about this in different ways. And it's my hope that we can use those platforms in order to bring attention to the work that my elders and other Black women have been doing for quite some time, and also start to ignite some change, right? So quickly, I want to kind of go through one of the primary tenets of our project, and particularly our 5 guiding principles. And so in Cite Black Women in Critical Praxis, we talk about those 5 guiding principles. These are principles that actually were our New Year's resolutions in 2018. And they kind of blossomed and turned into guiding principles from New Year's resolutions. And they continue to be the backbone of our project. And so our 5 guiding principles are the following. Number 1, read Black women's work. Number 2, integrate Black women into the core of your syllabus in life and in the classroom. Number 3, acknowledge Black women's intellectual production. Number 4, make space for Black women to speak. And number 5, give Black women the space and time to breathe. So let me go over them really quickly before we close. Number 1, read Black women's work. You can't cite us if you don't read us. That's what I will say about that. In order for us to do this work, we have to go out and read Black women. And I often hear that people say, well, I don't know who the Black women are in my discipline. Excuse me. I would say go out and find out. There are Black women doing critical and amazing work in all disciplines. And across all disciplines, by and large, Black women are ignored and erased, despite that amazing and critical work. Make it your business to go out there and find out who they are and read what they're talking about and figure out what it is that Black women are contributing to your fields. Number 2, integrate Black women into the core of your syllabus in life and in the classroom. So once you've read the Black women in your fields, once you've read all these new and wonderful books and articles and papers that you had never seen before, the next step is to figure out, how do these ideas change the way that I see and understand the world? What is it that I need to do in order to bring this into the core of the way that I understand my approach to my discipline and the core of the way that I'm teaching others to understand my discipline? So one of the things that I find, particularly after, you know, all of the kind of conversations around race in 2020, everybody wanted to talk about, you know, in talking about Black Lives Matter, everybody wanted to try to figure out a way to diversify whatever projects that they're working on. And so everyone was just trying to tack on something Black into everything that they were doing. And one of the criticisms that we have of that is, it's not enough for you to just add somebody onto a project that already exists. You actually have to engage their work and allow their work to shift the way you're thinking. And if you're not allowing the work to shift the way you're thinking, you're not doing the true work of actually deconstructing and decolonizing your ideas. And so this particular guiding principle is about doing that work. What does it mean to decolonize your ideas? By integrating Black women into the core of your syllabus in life and in the classroom. Number 3 is acknowledge Black women's intellectual production. So once you've read us, once you've incorporated us, make sure you let everybody know that that's where you got this idea from. You would be surprised how many people I have seen over the years listen, incorporate, and then forget to cite. And that's in a project around citing Black women. So it's very easy to forget to cite, especially when you integrate things into the core of your syllabus. When it changes your thinking, when it changes the way you approach the world, you start to rattle things off and you forget that you need to acknowledge where you got it from, right? This is just a reminder. Don't forget to go back and say, hey, it was so-and-so. Hey, it was this person, right? And then when you find out that there's other people who are doing things, you also try to acknowledge them as well. Now, I admit, and I will also say that it's impossible to acknowledge every single thing that has influenced us over the years. It's just impossible. But what's important is the effort. What is important is the acknowledgement. What is important is the pause and the inclusion, right? I'm sorry, I need to get some water. What's important is the pause and the inclusion. And so make sure you acknowledge the intellectual production that's going on and that you make it your business to cite and to reference and to always look back. Number 4, make space for Black women to speak. So this is the next step. Once you've read us, once you've incorporated us integrally to your work, once you have cited us, make sure that you are allowing us to speak for ourselves. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of is people, everybody wants to talk about Juneteenth. Juneteenth is around the corner. I live in Texas, so Juneteenth is a big deal for me. Everybody wants to talk about Juneteenth. Everybody wants to talk about Black history. Everybody wants to talk about all these things, do all these celebrations and these moments. But then when you look at the program, there are no Black people. There are no Black women. We know how to speak for ourselves. Excuse me. We know how to speak for ourselves, and we need to be allowed to speak for ourselves. And so that is a political statement. It's a political act to actually allow Black women to have the space to speak and to take a step back and give us that space. That is part of this political project. And finally, give Black women the space and time to breathe. And so this one next to number 4, it's always, always kind of funky, right? So invite us, allow us to speak. But if we're overwhelmed and burnt out, let us also take a step back. Don't rely on us to do all the labor for you. And so one of the things that people sometimes come to me with is, oh, can you do this for me? Oh, I really want to cite Black women. Can you give me a list, a bibliography? Can you make a syllabus for me? No, I really need for you to do that work yourself because I'm doing a lot of work myself, right? Recognize that Black women in particular are overtaxed, overspent, over everything, right? Within the academy, we are some of the people who do the most service. We are some of the people that do the most intellectual and the most mentorship and the most mentorship and pedagogical labor. And so we're really stretched thin and we need breaks. Whenever there's a time where someone who's an ally, a non-Black woman who's an ally, can take a step and give Black women some energy, give Black women some space, give us a break, that is always welcome. That is something that is just as much of a substantive contribution to this work as is actually, producing ideas or doing other kinds of labor, right? So if you're giving me a break, you're allowing me the time and space I need to recharge so that I can get up and do this work another day. And part of the reason that Black women have had such a hard time getting our work published and getting our work recognized is because we are so overtaxed and overlabored in so many different ways. And so the obstacles and hoops that I have to jump through to write an article are so much different from the obstacles and hoops that my colleagues that don't have to deal with racism, sexism, classism, and all the other isms, have to deal with. And so by giving us a break, you're allowing us to make up some of the time and the space and the playing field that's put us behind the 8 ball. So I'm going to end it there. And I want to just say thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Prof. Sassy. You can also find Cite Black Women at the citeblackwomencollective.org, our website. But the best way to get in touch with us by far is through our social media. You can follow, or please follow, excuse me, Cite Black Women on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook for more information and conversations on Black women's intellectual contributions, and for more information about how you can collaborate and amplify this work. Thank you so very much for listening and for being present and attentive, and I can't wait to talk with you in our Q&A.
Thank you all for joining us. I know our participants are looking forward to live Q&A with you during the Institute in June. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.